Today we're going to talk about the history of Garfield Ridge. Just as a note, Garfield Ridge is a neighborhood of Chicago. Its borders are defined by the city of Chicago. The borders of Garfield Ridge, just so we know, the official borders are Harlem Avenue on the west-hand side, the train tracks that run just by Knox Avenue on the eastern end, 59th Street on the south end, and 51st Street until you get to Laramie, and then it follows the border of the Stevenson Expressway until the Stevenson Expressway and the train tracks by Knox Avenue meet. So those are the official borders of Garfield Ridge. But when we're talking about the history of Garfield Ridge, I'm talking about the history of the area, all the outside influences that went into defining this neighborhood. And there are areas that surround us that had a lot to do with the history of this neighborhood. And over the years, it wasn't always called Garfield Ridge. The city of Chicago in the 1920s put together a list of neighborhoods of Chicago, and so then Garfield Ridge officially took on that name. But as you'll see, it was called different names over the years. Names such as Archer Limits, the West End, Sleepy Hollow. It's got a lot of different names, and I'll explain to you about the history of those changes over the years. Before I can start in the history of the neighborhood, I want to give you a little bit of the history of why this part of the city is important. Starting back probably in ancient times, as far back as before history was recorded, there was a bunch of geographical features here that really lended to the development of this area. So what you're seeing here is something called the Chicago Portage. When Joliet and Marquette came exploring in this area in the 17th century, they wanted a path, a waterway path. You know, the superhighways of the 17th century were the waterways. So they were able to sail through the Great Lakes, through the Chicago River, and they needed a way to connect and get into the Mississippi River system. Well, the shortest place to do something like that, there wasn't one continuous route. So there was something called the Chicago Portage. It was known to Native Americans as far back as prehistory. They indicated to them that they could take this short little portage. A portage is where you lift your canoe, you know, and you walk your canoe over a short distance. So they would have taken their canoe through the Great Lakes to the Chicago River, taken their boats out about modern day, about 31st and Albany Avenue, walked a short distance, and been able to put their boats into the Des Plaines River, right just west of Harlem Avenue here. There's a park called the Chicago Portage National Site on 48th and Harlem, commemorating their, you'll see a giant statue of Joliet and Marquette, commemorating this voyage of theirs. The reason that they had to portage around, there was a bit of water here that existed called Mud Lake. Mud Lake was an ancient sort of swampland that existed. It ran from about 31st and Albany to about the Des Plaines River. Here's the Des Plaines River around Harlem. And it was this mucky, marshy mess that you kind of had to walk around, because if you tried to walk through it, you would accounts of people trying to walk through this indicate there were leeches and things like this in this swamp, and it was very messy business. They used a couple of high roads on either side of Mud Lake to carry their canoes to get it into the Des Plaines River. So one of the routes was this southern route here that ran diagonally and parallels modern day Archer Avenue. The reason Archer Avenue was considered a Native American trail and such is because it follows roughly the path of this ancient portage road. And there's also a road on the north end of the lake, High Road, another diagonal street. And if you know of another diagonal street on that end, it's about Ogden Avenue. So if you ever wondered why those streets are sort of diagonal, a lot of diagonal streets in Chicago follow Native American routes. So they didn't follow exactly those things, but Archer Avenue for sure is very close. There's a book written in the 1920s that tried to follow their original path, and it was just a few hundred feet off of Archer Avenue was the original path. So that's a little bit, and the book about Archer Avenue actually gets into that a little bit in real detail. So this mud lake, during the wet seasons, the Des Plaines River would overflow, and Mud Lake would be a lake. And they could actually sail their canoes from the Chicago River right in through Mud Lake and right into Des Plaines without ever having to lift their boats out of the water. And that was a very handy thing to do, considering all the supplies and things that they would have been taking. So Joliet and Marquette did come through this area. More than likely, they took the North Portage Road, but if you look at old maps of this area, you do see a road indicated here called South Portage Road. And you'll see indicated on here, Long Portage, they call it South Portage and Long Portage and a couple of other things. But Mud Lake, if you ever noticed, in Garfield Ridge, about 53rd Street, there's sort of a ridge that goes down and it gets to kind of lower land as you go toward 51st Street. Well, just north of 51st Street is where Mud Lake would be, back in the area that's now owned by the industrial district there, the factories. That's about where Mud Lake was. And just from talking to people that grew up around there, they even into the 1950s and 60s and 70s, there were little lakes, things they called hidden lake, and little swim areas that existed back there because they were sort of remnants of this old lake there. As the factories moved in, this land was filled in, and now you can't really tell. There's a few little hidden remnants of what could be considered Mud Lake if you travel back in the foresty area west of Oak Park Avenue, but it's nothing of what it used to be. And so over time, Mud Lake sort of disappeared. Here's a map of what Mud Lake would have looked in this area. If you can't tell, this is 51st Street here, and this is Central Avenue. So it gives you an idea of where we're at. So Mud Lake would have just come up to 52nd Street, maybe a little bit further here. So the area back there in the factories is exactly where Mud Lake was. And if you look on old maps, that pre-1900 maps, you'll see an outline of Mud Lake. It looks like a soup ladle or something they always say. And then here's kind of the Portage Road they would have taken, and then here's Archer Avenue, kind of where the other one is. As they built various canals and stuff, which I'll talk about, Mud Lake kind of dried up. Here's a picture of that book from 1927, where they were kind of trying to find this route that these explorers would have taken. And here's what was kind of left of Mud Lake. This is about 51st and Nottingham, a little bit north of the tracks there. And so you see some low-lying land. This is kind of what Mud Lake might have looked like. By this time, it was only a bunch of little ponds and things like that. On this Mud Lake was an area of oak trees. It also appears on old maps. They called it the Point of Oaks. It would have stretched from about Oak Park Avenue all the way into Summit. It was this giant grove of oak trees. Later on, when they built the Illinois-Michigan Canal, this was kind of an impediment in all these trees, and this is sort of the highland too, where this Point of Oaks is. If you go around 53rd and Oak Park and to the west, you'll still see some oak trees there. Most of them have died off, but this is how it would have looked in 1925. This photo was taken at 53rd and Oak Park. Obviously, there wasn't any development to speak of at the time there. By the mid-1800s, Illinois had the idea, like everyone else, to build a canal. Starting in 1836, they started building the canal, and by 1848, they had finished it. The Illinois-Michigan Canal originated in Bridgeport, follows the line of the Stevenson Expressway, because the Stevenson Expressway was built over the top of the Illinois-Michigan Canal, and went all the way out to Ottawa. The canal would have taken you. The stretch from Bridgeport to Summit, it was called the Summit portion of the Illinois-Michigan Canal. This is important to the area, not only because it's just north of us, just north of the neighborhood, but in order to finance the building of this canal, the government was selling the land on either side of it. Most of the land to the south of the canal, which would be in modern-day Garfield Ridge and Summit, was purchased by a gentleman named Long John Wentworth, who was a mayor of Chicago in the 1860s. Beginning in the 1850s, he was a land speculator, so he bought up 4,700 acres of land around the canal from the canal people. And on the north end of the canal was purchased by another former mayor of Chicago, William Ogden. So that's probably why the street bears his name, on the north side of the canal. And Long John Wentworth was significant because he tied in, he bought all the land that comprised Garfield Ridge, Summit, Clearing, Bedford Park, Stickney, so all the areas around here, he kind of consolidated the whole thing. He had quite an empire of things out here. Now, the commissioner, one of the canal commissioners' name was William Archer. And in order to oversee the building of the canal, the government commissioned a highway running out from southwest of downtown Chicago. Originally was, like I said, a Native American portage trail. They originally named it Widow Brown's Road, due to the fact that the only thing along the route of that way was a gentleman named Brown, apparently, and he had passed away, and his widow was of some significance, and her house was the only house along the route, so they called it Widow Brown's Road. This is a drawing around the Bridgeport area. This little street running through here, you can't read it here, but it says Road to Widow Brown's house right here. And it was commissioned as a highway. The main use of it by that time was to oversee the building of the Illinois-Michigan Canal. And because the canal commissioner's name was Archer, William Archer, it took on the name of Archer Avenue eventually. Old Widow's Brown Road did become Archer Avenue. Later on, it was used as a stagecoach route. It actually connected people going all the way out to Bloomington. They would come through this stretch of land here. And there's some accounts of people coming through this area, although there was nothing here. They described just, massive prairie lands and things like that, because there was nothing here at the time. In fact, there was a stagecoach stop in Summit on Archer, and in Summit there's a street called Lawndale, Archer and Lawndale, roughly about Harlem. So there was a stagecoach shop there in the 1840s. If you read some old accounts of Chicago history, you do find that indicated in there. So real close to us. So there's Long John Wentworth, like I said, a former mayor of Chicago. He came to Chicago in the 1830s, made a name for himself. The Wentworth name is pretty famous going back to England, and quite an empire of people. But he was 6 feet 6 inches tall. He was a contemporary of Abraham Lincoln and would have towered over Abraham Lincoln a little bit, to give you an idea of how tall he was. But like I said, what he did is he purchased all this land just south of the canal, and he ran a farm. He called it his Summit Farm. This area was not part of the city yet, and the town of Summit appears on maps as early as the 1820s, 1830s roughly. So he called it his Summit Farm. He raised cattle. He had dignitaries out here. He would travel along the railroad that exists by 51st Street. It used to be called the Chicago and Alton Railroad. He would travel out here, or sometimes he would take the Illinois-Michigan Canal out here, or sometimes he would take Archer Avenue, although Archer Avenue was nothing more than a dirt path, dirt road really. So, but he did permanently move out here in the 1860s after he retired from politics. He built a farmhouse on Archer and Harlem. Let me get to that actually first there. It existed on the corner of, on the north side of the street, a little bit east of Harlem, set back, and it faced to the south, kind of where Walgreens and the European Chalet Hall are. It sat there from 1868 to 1968. I will talk a little bit about the history of it in a minute, but it was featured architecturally significant. It was featured in books. They did studies of architectural famous houses in Illinois. It appeared in there. And his Summit Farm, he ran more like a hobby. He had a lot of money, and he liked to dabble in different things. He raised what they call blooded cattle. There were a lot of farming magazines and newspapers at the time, and he always used to submit articles and things like that. If you look at the newspaper classifieds around the time, he's always selling his cattle and things in there. So he ran this farm out there. He also leased out a lot of the land to various people. He called it his Mud Lake land. And he liked the fact that the Des Plaines River would overflow, because in the wintertime he would run an ice farm. He would make ice and ship it out to various places. He would take that water that overflowed, and he created little, I don't know, catching basins for it, and he would freeze it, and him and Ogden actually ran a ice farm. Now, at other times they wanted to drain their land, and they built various ditches to drain the water out of there, which confounded the city, because the city had reversed the flow of the river. But by them building these ditches, the water would come out to the Des Plaines, overflow back into their ditch, from their ditch back into the river, and repollute it again. So they got in a lot of trouble with the city until the city built a dam called the Ogden Dam, right near, right as you go over the Harlem Bridge. If you would look straight down into the water there, it was roughly in that area, and it was in existence until the 1890s. Now this is a map, a roughly drawn map. It's actually drawn by the gentleman who wrote the clearing book of the land holdings of Mr. Wentworth. This is what would be the I&M Canal. So figure this is the Stevenson Expressway. This is about 65th Street. It shows you where the airport is. So he owned all of this land in here and a little bit over here as well, and a couple little tidbits over there. So he owned quite a bit. Now the significance of that is so here's some other views of his house taken from different architectural magazines and newspapers at the time. This is a picture of it in 1968. It was it had broken windows, and it was really run down, and it was demolished in April. A gentleman by the name of Cyrus Parlin was a farmhand that worked on the farm. He took over the ownership of the farm after Wentworth passed away in 1888, and him and his family lived in the house until 1968. I spoke to a member of the Parlin family at one point. They just told me that they're still in the area, and they just told me that the house was run down and still had coal heating, and it was too hard to maintain, and so it had just fallen into disrepair. So Cyrus Parlin was sort of the connector between Wentworth and the modern time here. Around the same time, this is about in the 1870s, out south here in Clearing. In fact, just probably if you imagine where the Fair Share supermarket is, going all the way back to the railroad tracks, there was a group of streets that started appearing on maps. The gentleman who wrote the Clearing book, for lack of a better name, called it the Lost Village. You would see maps like this that would show Archer Avenue, here's Central. You would see nothing around there, and all of a sudden you'd see this grouping of streets that had various names like Coburn, Lansing, Gould, and you didn't quite know what to make of it. We did a little digging, found out that these were names of some railroad executives at the time, and I think this was a little bit of speculating going on. They knew the railroads were headed out this way soon, and they were purchasing up land and dividing streets up and everything. But you see these Lost Village in various maps of the time, and in fact, a remnant of that Lost Village. If you think of the streets south of the 59th Street, from 59th going on to 63rd, there's only one place street in there. It's called 60th Place. It's a short little run of street that goes 2 blocks long, and it's called 60th Place. It's actually a remnant of one of these streets that's left over. There is no 60th Place, doesn't run anywhere else except exactly where this shows on this map. So if you ever go by a little bit west of Narragansett on 60th Street, you'll see this little street in the middle called 60th Place. In fact, here's a real estate map from 1928 showing you here's Narragansett Avenue, here's 63rd, and there's a little street here called Hoyt. Well, nowadays that street is called 60th Place. It just runs right there. That's all it does. So it's a little remnant of this lost village that pops up on maps. And like I said, about in the 1870s, we kind of see it all the way through 1928, and then it just disappears. After Wentworth's death in 1888, his nephew, Moses Wentworth, took over the estate and was interested in still leasing a lot of this land. Well, the most permanent group that took advantage of these leasing of land were a group of Dutch farmers. And they started in about the 1880s to arrive in this area, and they leased what they call the Mud Lake land. And one of the first things you do when you want to make a permanent settlement somewhere is, you establish what's important to you, and churches are always important to people. So they established a couple of churches. In fact, the very first church that was established was something that eventually became the Bethel Reformed Church. Bethel Reformed was on Austin Avenue up until about the 1960s or so. The Dutch church, though, had a little schism. Now, while Bethel had its roots back in the 1890s, they had built various wooden shacks on 57th and Meade, and then another one was on 55th and Moody. Now, these little wooden shacks that were churches were eventually torn down, and then they built the Bethel Church. And then when the Dutch church had this schism, they split. They had some differences about some of their beliefs, and they created what's called the Christian Reformed Church. This church here I include because it's still there. It's no longer a Dutch Christian church, but Archer and Mayfield, right across from the Mayfield, just east of the Jewel, there's a church and a parsonage. If you look, they look exactly like this, except the steeple has been lowered due to some airport regulations, but it's still there. It was erected, here it says 1915, but I have a couple of records here that say it was erected in 1911. Now, the reason it says Summit there is because this area was not part of the city until 1915. So when it was kind of an unincorporated area, and I'll explain to you in a few minutes of what I mean by that. But the people considered it, some people called it Summit, some people called it Stickney. It had various names, and I'll tell you the reason for that. Now, here's a group of Dutch farmers. This is from that book. This is the Schutt family. And I've actually done some of these talks, and people have said, "Oh, I knew the Schutt family," so they're around for many years. In fact, one of the ladies that does come here to one of our groups that meets here every week is married to one of the Schutt families, so they're still very local. This is a picture of them at 55th and Central. See, it says Summit, 1905. They're probably waiting for a train that's on Central there, but no, I'm just kidding. But the Schutt family is very prominent in the censuses of the time, and they were attendees of that church. They were some of the pioneers of that church that I mentioned. Some of them probably hand-built some of those wooden shacks that I mentioned in various parts of Garfield Ridge. Starting in 1901, the streetcar was pretty prominent around the city. So a company called the Chicago and Joliet Electric Railway built a terminal on Archer and Cicero, right where the Brandy's restaurant was, or still is. They're not open, but they provided an interurban service, meaning their trains went through various urban places. It would start on Archer and Cicero. Now, this before it was part of the city. It wasn't part of the city yet, and it would take you all the way out to, as you can see by the sign, Starved Rock. Well, it wouldn't take you directly to Starved Rock. It would take you to Joliet, and somewhere out in that area, apparently, you would be able to jump on another interurban and get yourself out to Starved Rock. Yeah, it was quite an operation at one time. It was in existence from 1901 to 1934. The Depression finally did them in, and the demise of the streetcar shortly after probably would have done them in anyway. But this terminal went by various names. The name of the station, they called it the Archer Limits Station, especially after 1915. The area west of Cicero Avenue was annexed to the city in 1915. Up until that time, Archer and Cicero were the limits. So a lot of old-timers, including my grandfather, used to call this the Archer Limits. And this was called the Archer Limits Station. The neighborhood, even when it was annexed in 1915, began to, the people still called it Archer Limits. That was what they called the neighborhood. And the area to the west, toward Harlem, in the west of Austin even, they would call the West End. Some people still called it Summit. Some people called it Stickney. It took a while for it to catch on that it was actually part of the city. Later on, they ran a bus service out of here called the Bluebird Bus Lines. It would take you to the same places by bus, though. And to this day, part of the property is still a bus turnaround, so it's a remnant of what it used to be. So by Archer and Cicero behind there. This is a photo of that car at about looking east from Harlem Avenue. So we're standing on Harlem and we're looking east. So over here would be like Neva and things like that. So you can see that it was kind of a wooded area still, a lot of farms and things around there. So this is the Interurban streetcar, and it ran, like I said, it ran along about Archer Road most of the way. It followed the canal actually, and would take you all the way out to Joliet, and then from there you can get on other things. So about the same time out south here in Clearing, a man by the name of A.B. Stickney, who was a railroad magnate, had an idea of bringing the rail yards out here. But his idea is quite different from what ended up happening out here. He had an idea for a circular railroad that would have stretched, well, the square surrounding the circle stretched from 55th Street to 79th and from Cicero to Harlem. That was what he envisioned. And he built most of it. This circle here, there were remnants of this circle that you could find on aerial views of the neighborhood all the way up until the 1930s. He built most of this. He had an idea of bringing the rail yards out here, and other railroads would pay a fee, and they'd switch their cars, and they'd have a way of loading things and unloading things. It didn't quite work out because around the 1890s there was a bit of a recession, and him being quite the entrepreneur didn't want to waste time on a losing prospect, so he abandoned it pretty quickly. By 1897, he had abandoned the idea. It was taken over by a gentleman named H.H. Porter, who called it the clearing yards for the fact that it cleared some goods out of there. The goods would come in, would clear out, and he built a different design. Well, the name Clearing stuck for the neighborhood out here. Eventually, then the name of the town that came out of that was called Clearing, and then the neighborhood was called Clearing. But I want to mention Stickney because of the fact that he had these the idea for the rail yards, and he becomes significant later because originally this area from all the way to Cicero was broken up. They used to break up the areas by townships. Townships now don't really carry a lot of weight. They have some, taxing purposes and political purposes. But for the most part, townships don't carry as much weight as they used to. This was called Lyons Township. Lyons Township starts somewhere by LaGrange and went all the way to Cicero Avenue. So if you look on old maps of the area, right here, it's just called Lyons. In fact, they called what Wentworth's land was out in Lyons. At about 1901, a lot of people had begun to kind of settle out in this area. A lot of these farmers, Dutch farmers, were out here. You had a lot of other farmers, a lot of railroad people. Now they didn't, by living out here, they didn't really care for the fact that their township offices were probably somewhere on LaGrange and it was difficult to get to. So they had a referendum and they voted to create a new township called Stickney Township. Now Stickney Township is still in existence. It goes from 87th Street to 39th and from Harlem to Cicero. But the city of Chicago and Garfield Ridge and Clearing juts right in the middle of that. We're not considered Stickney Township anymore. We're called Lake Township. But for many years before this was part of the city, it was all called Stickney Township. So from 1901 to 1915, the area in Clearing and Garfield Ridge were called Stickney. It was owned by the township of Stickney. And this is just a little map showing you 87th, 39th, Cicero, and Harlem. Kind of showing you where the canal would be in this map. And of significance here in Clearing, at least, is a town hall building that serviced this area, built in 1912, because in 1912 the residents of the area decided to form their own town called Clearing. It was in existence for only 3 years. They realized very quickly it was difficult to supply their own police force and their own fire department and their own utilities, so they quickly succumbed to the allure of joining the city of Chicago. But this building here, which is now some condominiums, is still there at Parkside, or what's the street there? Major, yeah, 63rd and Major. It was called the Music Corral at times. It served as a post office, a VFW hall. It was a lot of things over the years. But it's still there, and on the top it says 1912 Town Hall. So now you know why. It served as a town hall for Stickney Township. And it was a very significant building. They had jail cells in there at one time. They had the Justice of the Peace was in there. In fact, the gentleman who wrote the clearing book has a real interesting story of the day that the city annexed this area. The county officials were in here, and all of a sudden the city officials come walking in, said, "Get out, we own it now, you're out of here, the city owns this now." But they came to a standstill, and just like City Hall now is split into the county and City Hall, this was split in half into a county, township hall, and also a City of Chicago hall. So it has a lot of history, that building. Starting in around the turn of the century, a lot of developers were eyeing this area. The land, Moses Wentworth was managing the land of his father, and he was selling it to a lot of developers. The most significant developer in the area was a gentleman named Frederick Bartlett. The Frederick Bartlett real estate company was very prominent in Chicago. Now they started right around the turn of the century buying up land. In fact, this is an advertisement of one of his sales that he was having. This particular one goes from, this is Narragansett here, and this is, I don't know, Newland or something. Whatever four streets are by Narragansett there. He subdivided them, and he called it Bartlett Highlands, as you can see right here. It wasn't part of the city yet, and he was marketing this land. And somewhere in the advertisement in here, he mentions that he bought it from Wentworth, the Wentworth family. He says, from Wentworth to us and from us to you, to show you a nice clean, people want a clean title on things, so they want to know that it came from Wentworth to him and from him to you. And he called it the Bartlett Highlands to accentuate the fact, because people knew this area as a swamp, as a mud lake, and things like that. So he wanted to accentuate the fact that no, this is higher up from there. You're not going to have flooding problems here. This is the Bartlett Highlands. In fact, truth be told, the area near Archer and Harlem is one of the highest points in the city of Chicago. It's why they call it Summit, for example. It kind of took on the name of this, accentuating this fact. Well, Frederick Bartlett created these little subdivisions. In fact, a lot of people's deeds to this day will say the second subdivision of Frederick Bartlett, the third subdivision. Look back at some of your house deeds, and you'll see this thing. This particular one was the second subdivision, and like I said, it's from like 51st to Archer, and from Narragansett to whatever 4 blocks. Nashville, yeah. So that was this one here. He did a lot. What he really created was, like most subdivisions now, he created what's called a gated community. He used to put these gates at the end of each street with a wrought iron fence at the end of them. I'm going to show you some remnants of that in a moment that you'll recognize. And he, like I said, in essence, like today, when you go to these new developments, they're like gated communities. Well, that's what he was trying to create out here, and he really, in his advertisement, if you go to this slide here, you'll see that the lots were about $395, and as you move farther away from Archer, they got even cheaper than that. He was really trying to sell these things, and he had special trains, like he ran his own streetcar out here. It said the Bartlett Highlands sale, jump on here, and he would give people free rides out this way. So he was quite the showman. One of the developments that he did, one of the earliest developments, is technically in Garfield Ridge. It's east of Cicero and north of 47th. It's an area called Sleepy Hollow. It was one of the first developed areas along Bartlett's route here. It has this little article in the paper tells a little not much about it, but a little bit about the history. They don't quite know where the name came from. Apparently somebody was a big fan of Washington Irving's Sleepy Hollow, but the area is still called Sleepy Hollow by residents there. It actually was annexed back in 1889 when the city limits were Cicero Avenue. So it has a much older history. And the story goes that they were so cut off from the rest of the area that literally when people would pass away, they couldn't, with the muddy roads and the condition of some of the roads out there, they couldn't get the bodies to a church. The nearest church was in Summit. That they actually had to put the casket on a rail car and get it to Archer Avenue, and then they would be able to get it onto some horse and wagon and get it over to the church or whatever. Now, the Frederick Bartlett, like any other developer, built little shacks along the way, some offices. This is a grainy photo from the newspaper. Archer and 64th Avenue. Well, that's Archer and Narragansett. So he had a shack, Frederick Bartlett shack, apparently somewhere. We don't know which side of the street or what, but it was erected there. So when he was doing these various things. There's a couple more here. Here's a side view of one of his shacks. This is a view of Archer. You can see like trees along the side. This is looking somewhere through the property around Archer and Narragansett at the time. It's very grainy. And then here's some people building a house. Now these gates that he erected would have been on either side of the street. On the north side of the street, mostly, and I guess on the south as well. Starting at about Austin Avenue, he had these two gates, one here, or two posts, and a gate going in between them. Now there's a number of gates still around. They've been reused over the years. Here it is in the 1950s. You could still see one of the gates here. This is on Archer and Mobile, and they are building some sort of store there. This is from 1950. So they were still around. They were reused over and over again for street markers and various things. The one that was still around, and I'll talk about this in a minute, was on Archer and Melvina. This was up until about 2 months ago. This was there. Unfortunately, in the beginning of December, a car crashed into this, destroying this gate. Enough of the gate was left that we think we're able to restore it. We're talking with the local cement company. Hopefully they can help us. They've given me the high sign that admit they could probably restore it. If not, to its original status, maybe we can do a rendition of it.
There's one at Archer and Nordica.
Yes, there is one on this one is on the north side. It's northwest side.
Barbershop.
Community Cleaner and a barbershop are right next to it.
The school.
In fact, the owners of Community Cleaners were the ones that restored this sign and have been very helpful in helping us restore it again now. It actually saved their store because here's a picture of the accident, and it saved their store from being crashed into. Late one night, somebody lost control turning the corner and unfortunately took out a 100-year-old, not knowing the significance of it. Now it's still laying on the grass there, but due to the weather, we haven't been able to do much with it. There is one on Nordica, right by Weber's Bakery. There's a tree right next to it, kind of pushing it over, and it has not been restored. There are several other ones. There are, this is in the Triangle by Narragansett 55th and Archer, in what they call the Lech Walesa Triangle. They have statues on top of them. You can see where the wrought iron gates would have come out. But they reused 3 of them in this triangle. So next time you're driving by there, take a look. You'll see them there. They're plain as day. I talked to somebody in Streets and Sanitation. They did confirm that as they were digging these things up, they wanted to reuse a couple of them because they were in good shape. They're big. They're about 500 pounds, solid concrete. And so they reused them as pedestals for these statues. There's actually another one laying in somebody's yard. They must have been present when they were removing this thing. Right behind the Wingstop, which used to be the egg store on McVicker there. If you look in the alley, there's a gentleman, he has it laying in his yard. And you could see where the street sign would have gone. So we do know the existence of a bunch of these. So now, like I said, this area was not really called Garfield Ridge for quite some time. Frederick Bartlett in his ads later on started to call it Garfield Ridge. He's sort of he coined the term Garfield Ridge. And Garfield Ridge comes from the fact that 55th Street, which is known as Garfield Boulevard further on to the east, is a main thoroughfare through the area. And the ridge that I was talking about around 53rd Street is a natural ridge which resulted from a receding glacier that cut out, that carved the land, and it's a natural ridge there. It used to be a beach ridge at one time. Right after 1915, these ads started coming out, so they had already sort of coined the term. The people on the eastern end of town, people from Sleepy Hollow called themselves, they said they're from Sleepy Hollow. The people from about Cicero to about Central called themselves Archer Limits, because of the fact that Cicero used to be Archer Limits. Between like Central and Narragansett, people took on the name Garfield Ridge. And then in the western end of town, people sort of call themselves the West End. One of our board members' father ran a newspaper. He called it the West End News. You'll see a photo later on of a store called the West End Snack Shop or something like that. So people even into the 50s were still calling it West End, Archer Limits. Some of the old timers were still, hanging on to those things.
There used to be a West End Savings and Loan.
West End Savings and Loan. There was a West End Civic Association, I think.
Yeah, my dad belonged to West End Sportsman's Club.
Yeah, so I mean, and even the street names. If you go into Stickney, 40-something, and north of the canal there, the street names out there are like Home Avenue, Wesley, Kensington. And as they cross over on our side, those streets become, Nordica and all the end streets. Well, even into the 20s, we found the 1920 census lists people living on 52nd and Kensington and 53rd and Wesley. And you're thinking, well, where the heck are those? Well, those people still were calling the same street names, even though it had become the city of Chicago and we had changed the street names to conform with the rest of the city. Meanwhile, again, in Clearing, like I said, they had formed their town of Clearing. This is a nice shot of 63rd and Central. This is Central Avenue, I'm sorry, this is 63rd Street here, and Central is going up and down here, showing you a streetcar that ran down 63rd Street and actually curved and ran down 63rd Place all the way out in front of the library, all the way out to the Argo Corn Products. I mentioned the Argo Corn Products because one of the big impetuses for people moving out here now, this is about the 19-teens, was, the developers were, Frederick Bartlett, if I go back to that ad, you'll see Argo prominently featured. The Argo Corn Products was a big draw for jobs out here. And he also, in that advertisement, mentions the rail yards because the rail yards were a big draw for people to move out here. By then, they had developed, the rail yards had developed an industrial area right here, 65th, right out here, all the factories. It's called the Clearing Industrial District. It was a big draw. In fact, the Argo Corn Products is the start of that, and then it moved to the east. And all the factories opened up and became a very booming area. People moved out here for the jobs. And this streetcar ran past, there was nothing along 63rd Place, but it ran past here only for the sheer fact that it would take you out to the corn products. And also along the industrial district. So that was the only reason for people to come out here at the time. This is a view of 63rd and Central looking to the south. The rail yards are somewhere back here. But you can see how, well, it kind of looks like this again now. But for a while there were a lot of buildings there. And but this is how it looked in 1910. There were some hotels back here, and now there's homes. And there were some public schools in the area. Now, to even confuse matters even more about what this area was called, when it was annexed in 1915, they didn't know what quite to call it right in the beginning, so they called it all Clearing. They called the whole thing Clearing. From 55th Street to 65th, from Cicero to Harlem was just called Clearing. So they had various schools, and they called them the Clearing Schools. One of them was on 64th and Major in modern-day Clearing. There's a driver's ed facility there now, but up until 1926, there was a school there. And this is a picture of it. The other schools in the area were located at 55th and Central, inside the modern-day airport property, on the just that corner right there. and that was also called the Clearing School. It was the precursor to Mark Twain School. The Clearing School on 55th and Central was built in 1892, was in existence until 1926 when Mark Twain opened. So the people that were going to Clearing School, like my grandfather, and I've talked to other people whose family have gone there, and now they would have been transferred over to Mark Twain School on 51st and Linder. The other school in the area, there were a couple, was one on near Archer and Rutherford. They called it the Tin Can School, because I'm imagining it was something like these mobile units now, you know, kind of metal in character, and it was in existence. Yes.
Okay, the story I heard was an aerial view shows that it was at Archer and Normandy. There were something like 14 buildings, I guess,
Oh,
2
okay.
for each grade. And
Okay.
a realtor who's brokered my home purchase told me that for 8th grade the kids in that area went to Twain.
Okay. It was actually a sub-branch of Mark Twain. They also had a branch of Mark Twain in the Sleepy Hollow at about 45th and on one of the K streets there at Kilpatrick, I think. There was a school over there as well. And then they built a school called the 53rd and Rutherford School, which eventually became Burns School. So those are the schools in the area as far as public schools go. This Clearing School, like I said, and then later on in 1926 they built Hale School on the other corner of the airport, on 61st and Linder, and it remained inside the airport property until 1953, when, because of the expanding airport, it had to move. I'll actually talk a little bit about the airport in just a moment. By the 1920s, we had quite a stable population here, and there were some businesses moving in along Archer Avenue. One of the earliest was called Midwest Department Store. It was originally like a country store that sold food and everything, eventually morphed into sort of a department store that sold shoes and clothes and all things like that. Felix Balin was the gentleman who started that. He was an enterprising person. He actually, because of the lack of bus service like you're speaking of, actually ran his own bus service from Archer and Cicero, busing people over to his store for no charge. So he wanted to get the customers out there. This is an interior shot of the store in the 1920s. The building is still there. I think it's called Claire's Boutique now or something like that. But that was the Midwest Department Store, real early business out this way. So here are some shots from the neighborhood. These came from a 1971 50th anniversary of St. Camilus School. And so this is a shot of 52nd and Mobile, just to give you an idea of the farming nature of the area still at the time. Even into the 1930s, people had farms, and even into the 40s. Here's a shot on 52nd and Mobile. As you can see, the gentleman's on a horse, and it's kind of open land here. Again, this is from this St. Camillus commemorative book. It has a lot of interesting shots, including here 52nd and Lorel again. Bartlett had been dabbling in a little bit of developing around this area, but there wasn't much happening at this time out in this area still yet in the 20s. In fact, the area west or east of from Laramie to Cicero and from Archer to 47th, there was nothing there. That area was one of the last areas to be developed. Not until the 1950s did those streets become divided and things like that. So it was sort of a dead area. Now, speaking of St. Camillus, other than the Dutch churches that were around here, and there was a couple churches out here in Clearing, the first Catholic church in the area turned out to be a mission church out of St. Joe's in Summit. They decided to try their hand at opening a church out in this kind of newly developed area called Garfield Ridge. So they called it St. Florian, and in 1918 they found a location, this store right here. The building is still there. I think it's a Mexican restaurant on Archer near Lockwood. At this time it was called Mr. N's or something like that.
J&S Market.
Oh, J&S Market. This picture is from the 70s. But it was the original church. They held church services in there. And this building here, which is still there on Archer and Lockwood, was their school. Now, eventually, as they became established, they build permanent facilities on 55th and Lockwood, land that they acquired in 1921, and they've been in existence. They've had various additions to that building, but as far back as 1921, St. Camilus has been around in the neighborhood. The other churches in the area came shortly after, St. James, St. Daniel's, and the churches out, Catholic churches out here, and Clearing came a little bit later. St. Symphosa actually is pretty old. St. Rene is a little newer, I think. But the very first one out in this area, at least in Garfield Ridge or Clearing, was St. Camillus. The school is now gone. The church is still there. Mostly serves a Polish population. Now, Hale School was built in 1926 on the corner inside the airport on 61st and Linder. Eventually became the airport, which I'll talk about in just a moment, started to require them to move because the planes were literally, several hundred feet away from them, taking off and landing. Well, part of the land out here that encompasses half of it's in Garfield Ridge and half of it's in Clearing includes the modern-day Midway Airport. Obviously, very important to the history of this area. Now, I'm not going to do it justice. I always cringe because I have some Midway historians in my presence, right, Bob? So I don't want to misstep here, but just to give you an idea, I always like to tell this story. As the government was laying out these townships, starting as far back as the late 1700s, they had these rules that said every township has to have 1 square mile dedicated for educational purposes. So if you look at a township map, they break it up into 32 little squares. Section 16, right in the middle of it, is supposed to be set aside for educational purposes. Well, it just so happens that Section 16 of Lyons Township is bordered by Cicero, Central, 63rd, and 55th, which we know today as the modern Midway Airport. Well, for hundreds of years, it was owned by whatever township's Board of Education. So it was owned by the Lyons Township Board of Education. It was then owned by the Stickney Township Board of Education. Now, Stickney has a claim for many years that that they still own. That the transaction from Stickney to the city of Chicago was never handled the right way, and there was some paperwork lost, and there's lawsuits and everything that they still claim ownership of. It goes on to this day, but was owned by the city of Chicago Board of Education up until 1982, when it was sold to the city of Chicago for $15 million. But the stipulation was that the land was to be used for educational purposes. So they built a few schools, as we found out. We built Hale School and also that Clearing School. But the land was leased to farmers. They had various cabbage farms and things like that on the property. And all the money from that would go to the county or the township Board of Education to pay teachers' salaries and things like that. And that was going along fine. In the early to mid-20s, the city was starting to lease part of. They were looking for an airport. The airline industry was growing quickly, and originally was called Chicago Air Park, a single cinder runway near 63rd and Cicero. And they would hold, flying lessons there and take tours, things like that. And by 1926, when they were looking for a municipal airport, they had several sites they were looking at. And they decided to take the corner, what they would consider the southeast corner of that property, and have an airport there called Municipal Airport, which opened in 1926. Although some history books will claim that it opened in 1927, but it officially opened in 1926. This is a view of just prior to it being the airport in 1925. You'll see farms on the airport property. We're looking, here's 63rd and, here's Continental Can, 65th and Central. So here's 63rd and Central. So here's the airport property. It's all farms. Here are pictures of the farms. There's windmills and cows and horses and sheep and goats, and This is a Harm family. They had a farm in 61st and Central. This is from 1917. We have a bunch of these photos. They were one of the many people who leased land, and their rent money would go toward the Board of Education. So here's a view from a history book written by a gentleman named Christopher Lynch, who does, he's quite the Midway historian, wrote several books on the history of Midway Airport. Showing you, this is 63rd and Cicero, and it's showing you how it expanded a little bit this way. Hale School's over here. Now, there were a couple obstacles to having an airport there, not realizing that the airline industry would, pardon the pun, but it would take off like it did. They had the school over here for one thing. There were railroad tracks that ran right through the middle down 59th Street up until 1941. It took an act of Congress to decide that the airports had the right of way over the railroads, which had the right of way for hundreds of years. And they rerouted the tracks to run down Parkside or so there. So there's double track now. So when you're stuck by two trains, one going this way, one going that way, you have this to thank for it because they double tracked it there. Now there's some controversy over, people said there was already double tracks there, but anyway, the train tracks originally ran through the center. Now on this side, this is 55th Street, on this side was a golf course right in the middle here called Chicago Meadows Golf Course, in existence up until 1934. And on either side of the golf course were some farmlands. In fact, my favorite photo of all, we'll explain it all here. Thanks for the photo, Bob. But this is the airport. This is 63rd and Cicero. Here's the airport, right? That little bit there. Here's Hale School. This is some stands that they had erected because they used to hold air shows over here because it was a nice wide open piece of land. Here's the railroad tracks going down the middle of the track. Here's the golf course. If you look closely enough, if you zoom in on this, you can see the sand traps and everything, and there's farmland here and here. Here's a picture of the clubhouse in the golf course. Now, apparently, not this one, but a subsequent, this clubhouse apparently burned down. They built another one, and then the president of the airport operations or whatever, he liked it so much that the story used to go that that became his place of residence. And there was a house sitting on the property of Midway Airport for many years along Central that supposedly belonged to him. But how did that story go now, Bob? He said that he actually moved it out and it became his summer home or something like that? We discovered much later, a member, Mr. Casey, the family, we talked to him and we found out that he liked the house so much he moved it out. What, Michigan you said?
Yes, it's
yeah,
still there.
It's still there. So he moved the clubhouse here out to Michigan. It's now his vacation home, his family's vacation home. So we finally got the real story.
He picked it up and moved it.
Yeah, he liked it so much. So, but this is, I thought we had originally thought this was the one, but it's not. So here's a publicity shot of Mayor Edward Kelly moving the tracks that ran through the airport. And I mean, he's not actually, he's standing over here and he's not moving them, but it's a publicity shot. I'm not sure exactly where he's standing, but this is a photo that ran in the newspapers at the time. So by the 20s, this area was filling in. This is Laramie Avenue. As you can see, east of Laramie, there's nothing where Vidum Park and all those are. Here's the airport. As you can see right here, it says Limits Station. You can see that it was still being called Archer Limits. That interurban car thing was called the Limits Station. And over here in Clearing, it was filling in, but there were some holes there. This is Central, around Austin or so, 63rd and 65th. There was nothing going on. And out to the west. In fact, these areas, like right where we're standing, wasn't annexed to the city until 1923. So it took them a little while to kind of get out this way, and eventually it took the whole area. This is Archer and Central. This is them laying the sewers, basically, in 1921. This came from the archives of the Water Department, actually, and this is looking to the north. as if we were standing on Archer looking toward the expressway. I've been told some of these houses are still there. This is a shot of 51st Street in Merrimack looking to the north. This is the Clorox plant, which is still there, but actually the Clorox plant is on this side of the street. I just want to show this to you because of the density of houses is very little here. There's a few houses, a few farmhouses here and there. There's always that one house on the block that everyone says, oh, there's that farmhouse that was there for many years. And I posted this picture on Facebook one time, and somebody told me, hey, that's my family's house right there. It was my uncle's farm or whatever. So I'm able to identify some of these. Here's an aerial shot in 1938. This is Burns School here. It kind of shows you the density of houses. Again, is very, very, we're just coming out of the Depression. We're still in the Depression here at this point. Here's Harlem Avenue. This is Archer right here. So this is, Stars and Stripes Park back over there. So it's not quite developed at the time. They had just built the bridge over Harlem, I think, not too long before this. Before that, you couldn't get over the canal at that point. A couple of things that we found interesting. In the 1930s, people around here would have gone to Kelly High School. There was no Kennedy High School, obviously. So they did a study. In fact, the gentleman who wrote this book was involved in this. And the students there did a study of the area that the school served. Well, when they came out this way, it's funny because they drew these maps and they put pigs and goats. And in some of the descriptions of the area out here, it describes it as farmhouses, dirt roads, and they call it a countrified appearance. Here's the golf course here. At this point, it was being called Laramie Golf Course, but it was still there. There's St. Camilus. Mark Twain is there. Here's the Rutherford School, it says, although that's on the wrong side. And back here, you'll see what's called a roundhouse. And if you look in this, whoops, let me go back. This roundhouse right here, I believe, is the roundhouse that is indicated in this picture, in this drawing here. So this is a very interesting. We have this thing. We found it downtown in the library down there. Really cool information about the neighborhood. Stuff you can't really find anywhere else. Here's a shot of Archer and Harlem in the 40s. By now, the area was very much filling in, and certainly after World War II, it really boomed. This is looking. This is where the Walgreens is. So right behind here would be the Wentworth house. You can't see it in this shot, but it's there. It was still there at the time. And this would be taken where the Burger King is on the summit side, looking over to the Walgreens that's there.
That's the old Standard Oil station.
There was a little bit of a discussion when I posted this picture because it also says hamburgers over here. So it was a hamburger place / gas station.
It was a place called Hazel Shack.
Hazel Shack, yeah.
It was behind the gas station.
Okay, so it was kind of a combo thing. By 1949, this is kind of a very far shot, but the area was really filling in. This is the area where Vidum Park is, kind of east of Laramie. They're laying out the streets. If you zoom this photo in very, very closely, you can see stones that they're starting to lay out the streets. This building right here is where many of you knew it for many years as Sears Outlet. Now it's like the post office and all that. But it was a Studebaker plant, opened in the 40s. Just like the Ford plant, which became Ford City, was a Studebaker plant, but then became a war plant. And then in the 40s, they built a housing development out here called Chrysler Village, because of the fact that there were workers from the Studebaker plant and the Ford plant would go there to live. Here's that building that they were building in the 50s. There's that Bartlett Gate right here. We call it one of those posts. These are some photos along Archer. This is Archer and Mobile in the 50s, just to give you an idea of the areas. There's a place called Tom and Faye's that's long gone now. Somebody in this room is actually in this picture, but this is a view of Archer and Rutherford in the 60s during one of the many parades that Archer had. As you can see, there's a jewel in the background. There's a couple of places here. It has a little bit different feel to it. There's a few more shots of this parade. showing you, I forget what that store is there, but it's some store. But this is where they sell the Christmas trees on Archer to this day, around Oak Park, I think. They were doing that. These were just various photos. You can see the makeup of Archer was different. They had some parking along the street there. And, so I guess as you went further west, I guess they had that ability. Up until the 60s, we weren't connected by any sort of interstate system. So beginning in 63, they started building what's called the Southwest Expressway and eventually became the Stevenson. Bringing us full circle because it was built over the top of the Illinois-Michigan Canal, which was pretty much dried up. In fact, this is not really them building it. This is the Illinois-Michigan Canal. They're removing all of this silt and stuff that had accumulated over the years. Even my dad tells me in the 40s, there was remnants of the canal still there, and he used to float down a raft down. He'd walk down to 47th Street or whatever, where the canals would be, and would jump in the canal there, what was left of it, and eventually it kind of dried up. So if you look at the embankment as you're driving down the Stevenson, you can imagine you're going down the canal and the embankment would be there the same way. So it kind of brings us full circle. And even, like I said, up until even 40s or 50s, this area was mostly farmland. I'm going to sort of conclude it here. We have, I passed out a sheet of paper with our website. We have all of these photos plus much, much more with little captions explaining to you what you're looking at on our website. We have some videos of various tours and talks that we've done before. And the hope is today, with videotaping this, we're going to get this produced and maybe put on a DVD or
Tell them to go to
whatever.
YouTube, Rob.
Yeah, well, you can get to it through our website. If you're on Facebook, we do have a Facebook site. I know there's a few people here that do that. And we also have files here at the library. You can come in any time and do some research. We're kind of disorganized at the moment, but you can get a lot of interesting stuff here. We're always looking for new members for our society. We have some books for sale. We have the Archer Avenue book for $15 for sale. And the Clearing book I'm going to sell today for $20. It has a lot of photos, some of the ones that you've seen here. The Archer Avenue book does not have any photos, but does tell you that whole history of Archer and the Portage Road and all of that stuff. So if I have any more questions, I'd be happy to take questions. I know I've been taking some as I went along. Anybody? Okay, well, the members of our society, the board members of our society, myself, our Midway historian representative is Bob Russo. He's also he's sitting in the back. Ed Kozak, Diane Johnson, a gentleman who did the Clearing book. His name is Bruce Beveridge. He also runs the Summit Historical Society, along with another man named Bob Cott, who helps us out, and another gentleman named Paul Walenga, who gathered a lot of this information for us. And if you'll look at the handout that I gave you, a quick history of Garfield Ridge, he's listed as one of the co-authors of this. I want to give him the props. And one of our members, Millie, who has supplied wonderful snacks at most of our programs. She's given us some donuts and cookies and such. So I want to thank her. Is any other questions about the neighborhood?
I have just two. One is, when did the Bluebird bus stop running?
Now, I believe that started right after the interurban train stopped in the 30s. So starting in about 35, 36.
Okay, one more. The Point of Oaks, that was a grove. Do you have any idea, did it just grow naturally there, or did somebody plant it there?
It was a natural area, and it was right on the ridge.
Outside of
It was kind of a high point. If you look on prior to building the canal, they did these surveys, and on every survey there would be this really concentration of trees. It was kind of an obstacle when they were building the canal to get through all these trees and stuff. So it's actually named, and they called it the Point of Oaks. As far back, I think even Lewis and Joliet called it the Point of Oaks. There's I don't have it here. I do have it I don't think I have it on our website either. It's in the clearing book. There's a picture of the Joliet and Marquette of going down in their canoe, and you could see up on a ridge there's a whole bunch of oak trees. It was actually in a drawing as far back as the 1700s, so it was quite a significant grove of trees. That's why it bears mentioning the Point of Oaks. So, and I have to suspect that it's named Oak Park Avenue out this way. Just so happened that it was right. I don't know if that's the origin of it, but
I would imagine.
but who knows? Because it ran further north too, but it's kind of a coincidence that it
I
happened.
think it was named after the village of Oak Park.
Oh, the Village of Oak Park. Yeah, probably. Most of the streets are named after places that they touched. There was a town of Harlem at one point, and that's why Harlem Avenue got its name. But so, any other questions about the neighborhood? Okay, if not, you feel free to look around through our various pictures here, and I'll be here to answer any personal questions.